do have potential for another significant year of flooding.
When the river gets out of control, there's just nothing you can do.
We just had high water all year.
We maintain over 5 million sandbags, 5 miles of HESCO flood barriers.
We went through a harvest that was probably the wettest harvest we'd ever experienced.
Across the upper Midwest, several states had their wettest in 123 years.
And on top of wet soils, that's what has us concerned right now.
But we are looking at extensive snowpack, which will all melt and come our direction.
Over the last 5-6 years, every year seems to outdo the year before.
The flood of 2019 was devastating across the Midwest and along the Mississippi River. The estimated damage was $17 billion across 17 different states, according to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. This was also the costliest inland flood disaster on record, claiming 7 lives between March and July.
This has led to a lot of anxiety heading into 2020, especially given a similar setup with a big snowpack up north, saturated soils and rivers already running high. Of course, forecasters across the Midwest have been keeping an eye on the situation heading into the spring.
We begin with an overview of the flood outlook. I traveled up the Mississippi River to talk to communities along that river, as well as meteorologists and hydrologists at the National Weather Service to get their take on flood 2020.
Pocket City Pub in McGregor, Iowa is filled with stories of past major floods impacting this Mississippi River community.
Right here, you can see the water is up here. That's actually a boat tied up right in front of this building and up a block. This is the Alexandra Hotel. That's how high the water was in 1965, which was a record flood.
At that point, we're holding back 10.5 foot of water with sandbags to save the Pink Elephant Supper Club.
This is a picture of Marquette, Iowa in 1965 in the same flood. And you can see the old bridge approach here.
The whole town would come together, sandbag and fill in. You see neighbors that never talked to each other forever. We're sandbagging side by side, and after the flood was done, they wouldn't talk to each other again.
There's still evidence of the lasting effects of the 2019 flood along Main Street, pumps working well into the next flood season. While the record crust in McGregor was set in 1965, 2019 set a different record.
The spring rains and the melt brought off pretty significant flooding across the entire region, creating the longest flood in recorded history on the Mississippi River, all the way from St. Paul down to New Orleans.
The severity of 2019's long-duration flood was the culmination of 18 months of the most extreme weather this region has seen on record.
Starting in the fall of 2018, the excessive wet fall we had.
Bringing the potential for around 3 to 7 inches of rain over the next 6 days.
Then with the snowpack that we built up over that winter.
This is a blizzard now.
And this is 22 inches above normal.
And then ultimately the spring rains and the melt brought off pretty significant flooding.
The temporary levees that were protecting the city of Davenport failed.
We had a pretty wet fall again.
Manchester picked up over 3.5 inches yesterday, but in September they had 7 inches of rain.
We've been building, and over the last 5-6 years especially, we've been building that every year seems to outdo the year before.
The current snow depth across northern Iowa, southern Minnesota, and southern Wisconsin, it's not as extreme as it was last year. That's a good thing. However, at the headwaters of the Mississippi River, 6 to 8 inches of water is locked up in that snowpack. And when it begins to melt, it all has to come downstream.
Snowpack conditions now in the northern areas have been above normal. We've laid down a lot of snow cover already in northern Wisconsin and into northern Minnesota. February is the time of year where you can have really strong storm systems and put down a lot of snow cover in just a matter of a few weeks, which really can turn the tables on what you're looking at for flooding potential.
Really what's left here, how much snow will we accumulate the rest of the winter, and then spring rains. And that's a factor that I think leans against us, is that we've had quite a few wet springs.
Back in McGregor, residents are already watching the water.
We should be down around 7.5 or 8 feet right now. We're worried about the spring.
The river right now is high. It's going down, but it is high. Where the spring thaws, we're worried about what it's going to do.
This past year's corn harvest was the slowest we've seen in a decade across the country. We had similar weather trends last year, and now eastern Iowa farmers are planning ahead. In this special report, I explain the science behind Iowa's changing weather and how farmers are responding. We usually don't think about flooding in the winter, but it's something experts and farmers think about year-round.
When you're wet in the fall, you don't dry out during the winter. It just doesn't happen.
And we're wet right now. Soil moisture is in the 90th percentile across eastern Iowa. Dr. Dennis Toddy is the director of the USDA Midwest Climate Hub on ISU's campus. He studies the changing climate, especially as it relates to farming.
We have seen more times where our soils have been wet rather than dry.
In fact, 7 out of the last 10 years, soils have been overly saturated during planting season. They get so saturated due to rain falling, heavy rain events, and that water all soaks into the ground, and then in the winter, the ground freezes and the water can't escape.
Around this area, we have seen the last few years a pickup in the wet falls.
We've had more precipitation each year, more high precipitation events happening over the last several decades.
A 6-inch rainfall isn't out of the question anymore.
Jessica Brooks is the hydrologist at the National Weather Service in the Quad Cities. She studies and forecasts river flooding for parts of the upper Midwest and sees how more precipitation has affected the rivers.
We have seen that there's more flow going by certain gauges every year.
Brooks says there are concerns for flooding in parts of the area this year, but
agriculture is probably going to be seeing one of the bigger impacts right now unless we're able to dry some soils out.
And one farmer always keeping a close eye on the rivers is Mike Russell.
My grandparents built the house in '42. Never been water in the basement for any reason. And we weren't really anticipating or even believing that it could flood like it did.
Russell's farm in Mount Vernon is just a stone's throw away from the Cedar River.
My dad always used to say that. He'd get asked that, and he'd say that if we flood here, Cedar Rapids will be underwater. And he was about right.
The farm has a long history, which includes it virtually being underwater in '08 and another round of flooding from the Cedar in 2016.
When the river gets out of control, there's just nothing you can do.
Luckily, there are some factors this year that lessen the threat of river flooding on the Cedar, one being the extent of the frozen ground.
Not as deep of frozen ground means that frost will be able to come out of the ground a little faster.
That's because it hasn't been as cold this winter. However,
extensive area that's saturated is so much bigger than last year.
Russell dealt with the headaches of the wet soils last year.
We went through a harvest that was probably the wettest harvest we'd ever experienced.
Dr. Toddy says farmers have to adapt to the changing climate.
Okay, what can I do? Are there things that I can change in the way of my soils? Are there changes I can change in my variety that I can wait a little bit and plant a little bit later?
I planted when the soil was too wet, and when you harvest, you could see, quite a bushel difference across those wet spots.
Dealing with saturated soils takes patience and some new tactics.
Tracks for their combines and maybe not such big equipment. And we have to have areas where you can park trucks that are maybe rocked and take the grain to those locations rather than taking trucks into the field. And it's more labor intensive. You just need more help to do that.
As for exactly how this spring will pan out,
the precipitation patterns over the next few months are going to be a big key.
As we've discussed, the 3 big factors when we're dealing with the potential for flooding has to do with the snowpack, soil moisture, and frost depth. Right now, there are a few things working in our favor. This winter was not as cold as last winter, so the ground, the frost depth, isn't as deep as it was last year. And because we didn't have those bitter cold temperatures, we don't have as much ice along the rivers right now. However, we do have a lot of snow up to our north on the headwaters of the Mississippi. 2 to 6 inches of water still locked up in that snowpack is eventually going to be coming downstream. The one thing that's helping out some of the rivers locally in the rest of eastern Iowa outside of the Mississippi is the fact that we just don't have as much snow on the ground. However, once that snow starts to melt, it's going to go straight into the river system because that soil moisture is high. The anomalies are high. It is widespread that the water just is not going to soak into the ground. It's going to go into the river systems with the greatest concern right now along the Mississippi. With all that being said, meteorologist Brandon Marshall has the breakdown of the latest flood outlook.
The final spring flood outlook has been released by the National Weather Service, and the probability of major flood stage along the Mississippi has significantly gone down since the previous outlook was released in late February. However, still remains fairly high due to the fact there's still several inches of snow on the ground in the upper Mississippi River Basin. There's about 3 to 6 inches of water in that snow as well. So once it melts, it'll move right down into the river system. So let's take a look at some of the numbers. This is the risk of major flood stage compared to normal. It is about 1.5 times higher in Lansing, 3.5 times higher in McGregor, 2.5 times higher in Guttenberg, and about 4 times higher than normal in Dubuque, which major flood stage is right around 20 feet. Some of the tributaries in eastern Iowa, the risk of major flood stage is a lot lower because there's no snow in these watersheds. Elkader near normal, a little bit higher than normal in Garber of reaching major flood stage compared to normal. The Wapsie River in Independence and Anamosa, again, near normal conditions. Maquoketa River in Manchester, near normal chance of major flood stage compared to normal. Some of the other rivers in eastern Iowa, the Iowa River, all sites a near normal chance of major flood stage. The North Skunk River, the Skunk River, and the English River, all below normal chances of at least seeing major flood stage compared to normal. Finally, the Cedar River, Charles City and Cedar Falls, a below normal chance of seeing major flood stage. Waterloo, Vinton, and Palo near normal, below normal chance in Cedar Rapids, and near normal chance in Cedar Bluff. Again, the risk of major flood stage compared to normal. But this is something we're going to have to watch because the saturated soils do continue to linger into the spring months. Any rain that we do get, heavy rain, could certainly lead to some higher river rises. Something we'll watch here in the days and weeks ahead.
Coming up, the data that goes into the flood outlook comes from the ground and from the air.
Because it's just us out here.
I take you along for the ride as an elite team of researchers take off when Rising Waters returns.
As waters rise in your area, make sure you chime in this spring at iowasnewsnow.com.
There are hundreds of thousands of data points that go into the flood forecast. Some of those from a source you may not expect. In this Iowa's News Now exclusive, I take you on the airborne snow survey, flying low to forecast high waters.
And get a snow core.
Every day, hundreds of snow measurements are taken across the United States, but there are vast areas that cannot be reached by weather observers. That is where the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration Twin Otter aircraft comes into play. The mission? Snow survey. Iowa's News Now got an exclusive ride-along with the mission to measure the snowpack across northeast Iowa.
Are you ready to go? Ready to go. Nick, you ready to go?
This mission will be a 4-hour trip. We'll be collecting data over areas the River Flood Forecast Center would like to know more about.
Twin Otter NOAA 46, flying cloud tower, wind 310 at 6, runway 28 left, clear for takeoff, left turn approved.
With nearly 2,000 lines that need to be surveyed,
75, rotate.
And with good weather in the forecast, we're on our way to help with the 2020 flood forecast.
46, 5,300, climbing 5,500 VFR.
After departing Flying Cloud Airport just southwest of Minneapolis, our 30-minute jaunt to the southwest corner of Minnesota will give the two-person crew time to dial in their instruments and make their plan of attack.
So the machine in the back of the plane figures out the amount of water quantity in the snowpack in terms of what's called snow water equivalent, or SWE. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to fly over a series of survey lines, flight lines in Minnesota and Iowa, try to get an idea of what the snow is looking like there, and send that information upon landing to the National Weather Service. They're going to use that to predict spring flood predictions and snowmelt predictions for later down season.
The first survey line will be just southeast of Rochester, Minnesota, along Interstate 90. Prior to flying each survey line, the mission commander will go over a summary of the flight path for safety reasons.
We'll be just south of I-90. A couple towers at the beginning, 300 footers, 265, 315, all lower than our level.
To get accurate data, the NOAA crew needs to fly lower than aircraft are typically allowed to operate, and that requires a special waiver. At 500 feet, communication towers and wind turbines are just some of the obstacles the pilot needs to be aware of. The flight line itself is typically clear of these obstacles, but not always. More on that later.
Looking good. Kind of see how the highway straightens out up there in front of you, 2 lanes. You see his scan, and he's looking inside, outside, fighting for 500 feet over the ground, trying to keep that airspeed low, safely within the limits. That ground speed at 100, 120 knots.
The Twin Otter aircraft is used for a variety of missions over land and sea. The complicated flight patterns needed for a snow survey require more experienced crew members.
The flying is a little bit more dynamic, it's a little more challenging. The software is a little more dynamic and a little more challenging as well. So we tend to send our best people out here for this project.
Depending how close the survey lines are to each other, the crew can hit 10 to 15 per flight. and up to about 30 a day. Collecting the data is a rather simple process, which is done from the front seat of the aircraft.
We just did line Minnesota 416. On that line there were 7.1 centimeters of snow water equivalent, so 7.1 centimeters of water effectively averaged across that line. We're in Iowa, by the way. We made it.
About halfway through our trip is survey line Iowa 206, which starts near Riceville and continues to Saratoga. The Twin Otter crew can immediately tell there might be an issue with this line as wind turbines dot the landscape.
Windmills at the end, we'll keep an eye out for those. If we need to abort it, we'll abort it, no problem.
All tower in sight, one tower over the town in sight.
Roger.
About halfway through the survey line, new wind turbines are in fact right in the plane's path, and therefore the line is aborted. But it's not a difficult process to change the strategy going forward.
This line has probably been around for years, but as windmills continue to go up, which is fine, you know, we just need to adapt our survey strategy. But they are interested in this area for whatever reason, so maybe they'll move it against this road that doesn't have any windmills or obstacles on it.
Got it.
So I'm just going to make a note that Iowa 206 is not really a viable or safe option.
After 2 more low-level passes across northeast Iowa, ending by Waterloo, it's time to begin the flight home.
Line complete, 4.1 centimeters. Nice work.
There are many more lines across the upper Midwest which will be tackled in the weeks ahead. Missions like this keep the 10 to 15 NOAA pilots out for a long duration of time throughout the year.
All the snow up here is eventually going to melt in the spring. The more information we can tell the Weather Service about what the status is, because it's just us out here. You know, we're the ones looking around at the features, what the snow is doing, giving them the data, and they can make their flood predictions from there.
Preparation for this year is going to be abundant.
Communities along the rivers across eastern Iowa are getting ready for potential flooding in 2020. What preparations are in place and new changes coming this year when rising waters returns. You'll remember last year, temporary flood protection broke along the Mississippi River in Davenport. This surveillance video from the restaurant bar called Rome shows the moment it happens. Iowa's News Now crews were there showing you those floodwaters rushing through downtown Davenport. And it was that same day in 2019 that a new business was getting ready for its grand opening. I took a trip back to that business this year to see how they're doing and what Davenport is doing differently this year, following last year's failure to hold back the water.
Just like, hey, the wall's broken, and then I ended up back on the loading dock because pretty soon I was surrounded by water, and the next thing I know, oh, here I'm stuck on the loading dock, like inside the building, because I'm surrounded by water on all other side.
For the Half Nelson in Davenport, Iowa, what was supposed to be a grand opening turned into a disaster. The temporary levee protecting the downtown Davenport area failed, causing a flood of water to move through, impacting several businesses. While business is doing well at the Half Nelson, other businesses have been suffering, and many have since closed down.
For the moment, it's still like kind of a ghost town down on this block, yeah.
This year, the threat for flooding remains high along the Mississippi River due to a thick snowpack across the northern United States.
We've been watching this since last fall, being said, oh, we might have a higher risk for flooding this year and you know, could have another significant flood year.
Following the levee failure and a high-end threat for flooding this year, training has been done for many local municipalities and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to help prevent a similar fate.
General, you know, how to construct a proper HESCO wall, addressing the different ways in which you can build the structure and stack it. What to look for in terms of distress.
And for the Half Nelson, they believe the preparation this year could prevent what happened last year.
I have a lot of faith that, like, yeah, the preparation for this year is going to be abundant, yeah.
Other eastern Iowa cities have been putting in flood protection since the devastating floods of 2008. Cedar Rapids has been working to protect low areas in the city up to that 31-foot level. More projects are being done this year to get permanent flood protection. This includes the installation of a rolling floodgate on the 16th Avenue Bridge, a levee in the Newbo district, finishing the flood wall at Quaker Oats, and an extension of the flood wall at the McGrath Amphitheater.
Pretty well done with those low areas now, so we're all up to, I'm going to say, the same level of protection. And so now we're really going to work where it's just more of the low-hanging fruit.
The Public Works Director in Iowa City says their major widespread flood protection efforts are completed. Now they're just working on addressing localized flooding in the city.
And this has been going on for 10, 15 years now.
After years of heavy precipitation across the upper Midwest, what will it take to go back to normal? Or is this the new normal? When Rising Waters returns. The last 18 months of weather here across the upper Midwest was extreme. But is this the new normal? What will it take to get back to waters not being constantly high every single spring? We'll take a look in this climate change report.
Overall, the upper Midwest has been in a wet cycle, and this has been going on for 10, 15 years now. Across the upper Midwest, several states had their wettest in 123 years, their wettest calendar year. And that wasn't necessarily by, a few tenths of an inch. It might have been by a couple inches.
Since 1950, the Midwest has been getting wetter. In fact, Iowa and Missouri, on average, now have seen 6 to 8 inches of additional precipitation every single year. And that adds up pretty quickly. Since January 2018, we're plus 22 inches of precipitation, well above normal. Now, a bit of a bright spot. February 2020, that broke a streak of 21 consecutive months that were either at or above normal in terms of precipitation. We had below normal precipitation in February 2020. However, we're going to need a lot more than just 1 month to get back to normal.
Kind of reset that soil moisture profile system. We do need a gentle dry period, not a drought, but we need a kind of an extended couple seasons of that moisture being more close to normal than what we've seen in the last 18 months.
And of course, heading into springtime, that tends to be some of the most active time of the year. Any additional rainfall will have a big impact on rivers. Of course, we'll keep you updated with the latest forecast.
And you can always see the latest on those rivers and with whatever's going on in the spring on Iowa's News Now on CBS 2 and Fox 28 and at iowasnewsnow.com.
This was Rising Waters, a WeatherFirst production. I'm meteorologist Nick Stewart.
And I'm meteorologist Rebecca Kopelman. Thanks for joining us.